But before we get to that, I want you to see that not only was Daniel's life faithful, but his life was a testimony. Verse 5 tells us that. Let's read that statement in verse 5. Then these men, those men that were kind of coming against him, they said this: "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Here's secular people trying to judge him on how he rules politically. They can't find any fault. Now they go, well, the only fault that we're going to find is if we make it illegal to do what he does best, which is serve his God. That's the only thing that they could find against him. And it wasn't even a fault. It was something that they created so that they could find fault with him. His life was a testimony. And what we see with his life being a testimony is that his faith was genuine. The people against him knew that he was faithful. And they knew that he was going to be faithful to the point of death. And so they created something so that he would die. Their only complaint was that they had no complaint. They were so frustrated with him. And we don't have any indication that Daniel lived this holier than thou, righteous, in your face type of faith. He just served God purely. That's all it was. But these people were disgusted and frustrated. Have you guys ever been disgusted or frustrated with someone's faith? Has it ever just rubbed you the wrong way? And I know we're all believers, right? And the correct Sunday school answer is, no, I love everyone. When I was a kid and I needed correction, rarely, and I know you're shocked by that, so just take a moment and gasp, right? But when I was a kid and I needed correction, there would be times where I really wanted to embrace that rebellion. And you know the feeling that I'm talking about, where you're just like, I'm kind of content with my anger, or I'm kind of content with my frustration. And then, of course, my dad would come in and he would talk nicely and kindly and direct things towards Scripture, right? And in that moment, there was nothing that I wanted to hear from him. Because you're flaunting that right in my face, and I'm frustrated by that. I think that's exactly what was happening with these other people that were coming against Daniel. He lived a life that just served God purely. That frustrated them to the point where they said, let's create something to kill this guy because that just ticks me off. That's exactly what these men were going through. All because Daniel's life was a testimony and he was living a genuine faith. But we also know that his faith was true. That circumstances around him, even men creating false accusations, didn't change God's worthiness. And so he knew that my faith doesn't change. God doesn't change. Just because circumstances are rough, it doesn't change whether or not I'm praising God because he is worthy. What a testimony that is. Daniel lived his life so that God was always on display. And other people learned two things, at least two things, but I see two things here that other people learned because Daniel's life was a testimony. They learned that God is worthy to be worshiped. No matter what. Because the moment Daniel backs down from worshiping God and decides to protect himself or do anything different, what does that communicate about God? That circumstances determine whether he's worthy. But we don't see that from Daniel. He lived a life that was a testimony, and it showed people that God all the time is worthy to be worshiped. And it also showed that God is never to be abandoned. That there is never a circumstance where we should ever look at things around us or people around us and say, you know what? You are more important than God in this moment. Or self-protection is more important than God in this moment. Daniel's life communicated that God should never be abandoned. His life was a testimony. And we see that all in those first 5 verses of chapter 6.